I'm sorry, COST stands for. It's a Council on State Taxation, and Joe Henchman from the Tax Foundation. Before we resume, though, these gentlemen were saying, as they listened to us speaking with these gentlemen, that they have some comments. So, Greg, I'm going to let you go first. You wanted to say a thing or two about the Texas margin tax.
It's also in the context of if you guys have to consider something that complicated in an initiative process. I was, in a former life in California, I've been very involved in a number of the initiatives in California, drafting and supporting and opposing initiatives. And the one difficult aspect from a lawyer dealing with an initiative is that you get one crack at it. And unless the initiative in California, I think it's the same way here, unless the initiative authorizes amendments by the legislature, you're stuck. California, as much as we love the initiative process in California, and I have to do a bit of speaking throughout California, there's a lot of our membership, we do a lot of educational programs, and I always like asking people to poll. There's all these complaints about the initiative process, about box budgeting, targeting certain disfavored classes, that sort of thing. The tobacco tax is a great example of that. Would you do away with it? Would you limit yourself, give power to the governor and the legislature to pass taxes or to deal with the budget? And the numbers are always hugely against doing that. The people in California love the initiative process, for better or for worse. They'll complain about it, but if you put forward the people, in my opinion, you put forward the people of California the opportunity to significantly limit the initiative process, it would be crushed. Because I think it has to do with their sense of distrust for Sacramento, which is historic, and maybe some of their own sense of confidence that they actually know what they're doing, which is, can be debated probably on both sides. But so as you're thinking about, if you have to face this particular type of an initiative, I would particularly work as a tax lawyer because you're going to be faced with a very complicated tax that you can't potentially change. And so it was interesting listening to Dale talk about how there are all these bills to change the Texas margins tax, which was enacted legislatively. Some good, some bad, depending on your perspective. Some will pass, some will not. But you have that process available to you. But if you do this sort of a complicated tax by initiative, you're going to lose that opportunity, and you're going to be stuck with that, for better or for worse, that tax in perpetuity until you can, I suppose, sponsor another initiative to significantly change it.
So there is the campaign slogan against the initiative, which will not fit into a 1-minute commercial or on a bumper sticker, I regret to say. All right, so I'm resisting the impulse to reach over and pull his microphone toward him. Did everyone hear everything, or is it? They need to pass this back and forth unless you can hear him. Was it okay? Okay, I'll resist the impulse. How about, now, did you have a comment about the margin tax, Joe?
I did.
Okay, please go.
Dale spoke about the disparity you have between different types of business. Talked about the tuxedo store, the service center, and so forth. And I think he very diplomatically said, well, if you consider doing it, you should think about those and think about ways to not have that happen. I just want to emphasize that you can't, because it's inherently part of the structure of this type of tax. Margin tax, which in my opinion combines the worst elements of the gross receipts tax with the worst elements of a net corporate income tax. We have a lot of economists on our staff, and we've talked with a lot of public finance economists, and I've yet to find one that thinks that this is a good model that should be replicated. So, if you don't want to go down the path of Washington State and Delaware, which now has every industry with a different tax rate and a different way of calculating it, because I think that's where Texas is heading, because there's a lot of resistance to overhauling the tax, because then they've got to go back to the drawing board. You have a chance right now to avoid all of that mess from the beginning, and I hope you do.
Oh, I think I hear the words coming out of Carol Villardo's mouth. Unintended consequences. All right, I'm going to go back to the item I read right at the beginning when I said this is what we're going to explore. I read that a little prematurely. The fiscal outlook in 2010, at the beginning of 2010, where essentially it was dire, and the bottom line was The biggest concern for states is that the current economic crunch goes beyond the financial downturn. There are increasing structural deficits in state governments, and even as the economy turns around, states will face deeper, more entrenched fiscal challenges. The depth and breadth of this downturn is going to send repercussions for a decade, probably more. In addition to that, most of these kinds of transformational changes, the ones that they were saying needed to be made, they, experts, like the ones we have here perhaps, these transformational changes can't be really examined until after the states have regained at least some of their footing. Well, guess what? Fall of 2011, NCSL says that states have regained some of their footing. Fiscal conditions continue to improve, but at a very slow pace. A fall 2011 survey of state legislative fiscal officers found that the deterioration that dominated state finances in recent years has eased, revenue performance has improved, expenditures in most states are stable, and in a significant departure from past years, few states are reporting budget gaps. In that brief 10 months, though, it was a year and 10 months, excuse me, a lot of restructuring took place. National Governors Conference puts out a document in advance of their meeting, which they did this year. It was called Redesigning Government, and in it, the various states had obviously provided to the National Governors Association their success stories in terms of whatever they had done to redesign their government. Some of it had to do with Medicaid, some of it had to do with consolidation of public safety services. There were various things that the various states have done. You all know better than I do. Who did a good job? Who didn't do a good job? Structural deficits is a term I'd like to have explained. So I'm going to start with you, Greg. In terms of attacking that structural deficit, in terms of redesigning state government, who did it well, who didn't do it well, and please move the microphone over just so I don't go crazy.
Well, let's explain first what a structural deficit is. A structural deficit is basically an ongoing gap between expenditures and revenues. What you're anticipating is going to be the expenditures for the state over a period of years in comparison to the revenues you anticipate getting. And states, California's been notorious for this. We've got, what do you think, 8 years, 9 years so far we're running structural deficit in California, and really no end in sight that I can see. Because every year they may get through the budget process. They may get to a balanced budget for a year, but may be based upon revenue projections that are not sustainable. It may be based on one-time revenues that they're able to obtain by either selling property or by shifting money between funds. California is notorious for this. We've got about a third of California's actual spending comes through special funds. So they'll raise revenue for a specific program. We'll talk about this a little bit. And then they'll borrow against that fund. Well, that money's got to be paid back at some point. So that creates a bit of a structural deficit. You might get a balanced budget one year, but in the subsequent years, they'll have once again, it's a gap. California see this. Well, I think, from my perspective, Joe's a lot more closer to the expenditure side than I am, but I think a lot of states have attacked their actual gap better than California, for example, has been kicking the can down the road, trying to avoid this great fight between revenues and expenditures. We were talking on the phone, I think, when we started a week or two ago. And California's just a great example of what not to do. They have, for the last 7-8 years, really solved their annual budget problem by pushing the problem down the road, whether it's by inter-fund borrowing, whether it's by one-time revenues, whether it's by assumptions that just by any real objective standard are not rational or reasonable. They just want to get to the next year, get to the next budget cycle. At some point, that's got to come home to roost. We are going to have to deal with that at some point. The government's going to try to deal with that this year in tax increases, but it's certainly a significant problem for California. It goes to this struggle between spending and revenue raising, whether they're going to be willing to raise taxes to really pay for the kind of spending that people want. I think on a national basis, most of the states that have eliminated their deficits have really attacked that problem of bringing spending in line with the revenues that they have. And one thing I mentioned when we started out was know your economy. Look at what Nevada does best. If I give you advice, is that look what Nevada does best. Look at the businesses that you're trying to grow here. Look at what your strengths are, and then find a revenue base that plays to that strength. And then, you know, I'm always a big fan of Calvin Coolidge. Probably one of the forgotten presidents, but I always liked him because he had such a common sense view of government's role, which is that you spend what you have, live within your means because that's the ideal. Know what your revenue base is going to be based upon your economy, and you won't run into this sort of annual deficit fight that California finds itself because they're not willing to reconcile their expenditures.
So you're saying the unwillingness unwillingness to cut spending on the one hand, unwillingness to raise taxes on the other hand equals debt. That's because the default is to borrow.
Exactly, and California certainly has run up debt, and we've talked about some of the issues facing states long term is certainly debt, and that raises a big question for how you're going to pay that, how you're going to pay that debt off long term.
All right, but are there specific examples? Can you, and maybe you can and maybe you can't, name states that have attacked, and of course, public employee benefits, which I did not mention, are part of this equation as well, so, you know, I didn't even ask you that, but are there states you could name, because we do have legislators in the room, that have done a great job of redesigning their government?
With the public pension one, I'll give you two, one red, one blue. Utah and Rhode Island both adopted significant reforms on public employee benefits that bring it more in line with some sustainable level going forward. Just to give some more context generally, what happened in 2009 and thereafter was states were doing pretty well. They had lots of money pouring in. They thought the good times were going to continue forever. They had a very high spending base and a very high spending growth rate. And then the bottom fell out. So not only are we not at the peak of the boom, we're not at the peak of the boom plus 8% a year since then. So states have taken pretty much sort of three different approaches that different groups of states have taken to this reality. Some states have rolled up their sleeves and sat down and prioritized, all right, what can we do to adjust to this new normal of lower level spending and a lower growth rate? Indiana's done a lot on that, as well as Arkansas. In Arkansas, you cannot run a budget deficit because every item of spending in their budget is prioritized, and they only spend up the priorities that they have money for. And that's also a very democratic state. So this is not a partisan, something a partisan body can prevent solving.
You use the phrase new normal. That phrase, it has been used a lot. Another phrase that I have heard and read a lot is pre-recession levels. When we're talking about tax collections or consumer spending or almost any kind of fiscal measure, where you talk about pre-recession levels, it's just a phrase that people toss out. So that leads me to ask, is that merely a benchmark pre-recession levels, or is the implied goal to get to pre-recession levels? Is it to reinflate the bubble, what was clearly a bubble? Or are we saying, gee, since that recession, we've been able to get things under control? Why do we use that phrase?
I think it is a lot of wishful thinking. California, Illinois, some of these other states, they're basically treading water in the belief that we are going to return to the level of the spending we were at plus 8% since then. And that's not going to happen. And, you know, I think Illinois is winning in the race to become the first state to just completely default. They're already not paying a lot of their bills, and California's had to resort to IOUs a couple of times. But, I mean, these are not states you want to emulate. Both of the states have raised taxes a number of times. Illinois did a huge tax increase on individual income, corporate income last year, and it's made it worse. They've seen more unemployment. They've seen the situation worsen there. California's been a bit more mixed. They've done a different mix of temporary taxes and other types of things. And you know, I'm not going to beat the California horse to death.
Well, the gentleman from California may wish to respond. Do you have anything to say over here on the?
No, he's right. I mean, they come up with what they call revenue solutions. That's their term for like just about anything. It's like throw it all out there and see what happens. So there's rating funds, shifting things, selling. You know, one of the ideas was selling state buildings, and then getting a bunch of upfront money. But then you're going to have to rent back the buildings over the time, so they're going to lose money on that. But everything like that is a revenue solution.